WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange will fly to the Australian capital Canberra, and that's going to take place within hours from now following a plea deal to set him free. 52-year-old Assange has pleaded guilty to a single felony charge for publishing US military secrets in a deal with Justice Department prosecutors that secures his freedom and concludes a drawn-out legal saga that raised divisive questions about press freedom and national security. Assange has long been wanted by the Washington, this is the government there, for releasing hundreds of thousands of secret US documents from 2010 as the head of the whistleblowing website WikiLeaks. The plea was entered on Wednesday in federal court, and this is the capital of the Northern Mariana Islands, a US Commonwealth in the Pacific. He arrived at the court shortly before the hearing was to begin, wearing a dark suit with a tie that was loosened at the collar, and entered the building without really taking any questions. Though the deal with the prosecutor required him to admit guilt to a single felony count, it would also permit him to return to Australia without spending any time in prison.
Doing cartwheels is a good expression of the joy that one feels. That Julian is returned home, well, about to return home. The circumstances, there may be some questions to be resolved by the lawyers and the diplomats in the future, but having Julian home to an ordinary life after 15 years of incarceration in one form or another, house arrest, jail, and asylum in an embassy, is pretty good news.
Yeah, I've been speaking to him this week and just going through all the details with him, and very anxious, very excited, and he's looking forward to spending time with his family and being free, being able to have the sunshine on his face, hear the birds, go for a swim in the ocean back in Australia. So he's very much looking forward to that.
Come on, fire.
It's this 2010 footage of a US attack helicopter opening fire on civilians in Baghdad, including two Reuters news staff, that brought Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, into the crosshairs of the US legal system. A freedom of information champion instrumental in the leak of 91,000 secret documents of the US war in Afghanistan, Julian Assange's activism brought home the reality of some of America's most brutal military actions around the world. This included 4 lakh classified military files which chronicle the Iraq War, followed by the release of thousands of US diplomatic cables with candid views of foreign leaders. As America and its closest allies closed in on Assange, WikiLeaks came under intense pressure. In October 2011, Assange told NDTV WikiLeaks could cease to exist.
Over the last 11 months, it is a possibility that the establishment will win. Certainly, it has been difficult for us over the last 11 months to have been removed from 95% of our donations and revenue. We have been surviving on cash reserves the last 11 months. But that's not a situation that can continue. If it does continue, then it is inevitable that sometime during next year, WikiLeaks will completely run out of money, and that will be the end of the organization.
By this time, though, the writing was already on the wall for Assange. For the next 14 years, he would be in a battle to fight for his freedom. Accused of sex crimes in Sweden, which he denied, he was arrested in the UK. His bail eventually rejected. In 5 days, he took refuge in Ecuador's embassy in London and gained political asylum in August 2012. 8 years later, after his political asylum was revoked by Ecuador, Assange was carried out of the embassy in London and arrested and put behind bars in the United Kingdom. In 2019, the US Justice Department asked Britain to extradite Assange on charges of espionage. For the next 5 years, Assange appealed the extradition request, which was put on hold after a court said that the US must ensure that Assange does not face the death penalty. Finally, 14 years after the first set of charges against him, a deal was announced in which he would plead guilty. US prosecutors say Assange did not want to travel to the continental United States. For the last 5 years, Julian Assange lived in a 2 by 3 meter cell in the UK, isolated 23 hours a day. WikiLeaks, the organization that he founded, says Julian's freedom is our freedom. Assange's message to the media: journalism should be more like science. As far as possible, facts should be verifiable. Vishnu Shom, NDTV.
And to get more on this, we have Geoffrey Robertson, the legal advisor to Assange, joining us from Sydney in Australia. Well, he is an Australian world-renowned human rights barrister who's a legal advisor to Assange and worked on his Swedish case. Geoffrey, thank you so much for joining us. How rare would you call this kind of a deal that has been reached? Was it on expected lines?
This deal of this kind has been mooted for some time. It was used years ago to get a man called David Hicks, an Australian who was in Guantanamo, back to Australia when the government wanted him back. It was simple. You plead guilty to an offence for which you're probably not guilty, and the time you've served in prison is taken into account, and they can release you immediately and send you home. So it was that sort of deal that had been put to the Americans by the Australian government, and it's now come to fruition.
Geoffrey, how was the deal cracked? What sort of legal challenges did Team Assange face?
Well, there were a number of legal challenges, particularly the question of whether the First Amendment that secures freedom of speech for American journalists applied to him because he was an Australian. And of course, it's a big question for journalists in Britain, in India, wherever, that write stories about American firepower or the Pentagon. And if they upset the Pentagon, they could be extradited under this 2017 Espionage Act if the First Amendment doesn't apply to. The most good lawyers think it does, but this idea came up from the Trump lawyers a couple of years ago when they made this extradition request.
Geoffrey, is there a part of this case that still remains uncertain?
The First Amendment protects journalists. So the question was whether it protects foreign journalists like Julian Assange, who, of course, published the documents outside America, was never in America, and is not an American. But the view has always been taken, certainly by the Obama administration, that the First Amendment applied to him. So that was the subject, or one of the subjects, of the case in the English courts. So now it has collapsed, and I don't think actually that the Pentagon will be keen, because they do have some egg on their face. They had to accept his demand that he wasn't going to be brought back to America. He wouldn't fly over America. They've had to go to this small island in the Marianas chain, which is near Australia, so he can be repatriated there.
Mr. Robertson, what all has Assange been through during his time in prison? And being a high-profile case, it must have been even tougher. What's the first thing that Assange plans to do once he reaches Australia?
I think he will be able to speak for himself. He very often does. And when he comes out, that is probably the first question that he will answer. But he's been quite ill in custody. He's been in a prison with terrorists, or at least suspected terrorists, for 5 years. And he's been so sick that he can't attend, or he couldn't attend a number of his court hearings. So I think the first thing he should do, certainly be advised to do, is to get some rest and recreation, maybe in a Queensland island or somewhere, before he returns to the fray. He's suffered a lot. He's a martyr in a way for freedom of speech, and I think no one would begrudge him some time off.
Geoffrey Robertson, thank you so much for speaking to us here on NDTV this morning.